Today we're talking about G7 and asking really, is it worth the hassle and is it up to all the hype? Of course, G7 is the great gathering of world leaders, world's leading economies and open societies. That's the theory, and they're gathering in Cornwall this weekend. And I'm joined by Maggie Pagano, executive editor of Reaction. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. If you don't subscribe to Reaction on YouTube, just click the button saying subscribe. I suppose the first thing we should talk about, Maggie, is this tax deal that they've agreed in the last few days, and a lot of hype about that and about it apparently being the solution to tech giants who some people are saying are not paying sufficient amounts of tax. Do you think the agreement is what it claims to be? Is it really going to result in tons more money being paid?
I'm not sure it is. And I think it's also a little bit premature of them to present it as a tax deal. It's an agreement in principle. This is just the G7. They've got to get the G20 on board and the OECD before they can get anywhere. I checked Amazon's share price just before we started, Iain, and it certainly has not been knocked out of court by this news. The shares went down 0.4%. So they're clearly not too worried what implications it might have. Now, the problem, there are a couple of problems with the agreement. One is that the minimum is 15%, which some people say is far too low. And then the other point is that they're saying that they'll only tax 20% of the profits and those at 10%.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, most corporates do not make a margin of 10%. It's a very fat margin. Most companies would be delighted to make that, and Amazon certainly doesn't make it. And I think people sort of slightly misunderstand the Amazon business model. You know, it is a retailer, it's a very competitive market. I mean, I think Tesco is happy when it makes 2% profit margin, and it's a platform for other businesses. And there is a view, and it'd be very interesting to see what the accountants over the next few days make of these figures, because they'll be able to work it out in a much better way, is that actually it won't really touch Amazon at all. So they're not getting those that they perceive to be evading tax, if you like. So I think they probably have to hammer it down, and maybe, the 15% is possibly too low, because as we know, Ireland, certainly within the EU, and then I think it's Chile and Hungary have tax rates of 9 and 10%. So you might get, tax arbitrage emerging, and there'll be exemptions. So it's quite a dangerous area. But like you, I think it's good to have some sort of overall agreement. But I don't think this is probably.
Well, you see, I have some sort of philosophical doubts about the whole. About the whole business. But I don't really mind. I know tax competition has been a big theme, hasn't it, in the West? Well, really since Thatcher and Reagan, this idea that if you lower certain taxes, you attract inward investment. No. I don't really have a problem with that, because the kind of cartel approach that Biden wants, which I am in favor of, governments talking to each other and global cooperation between the democracies and central banks coordinating during an emergency and all of that. But I think my concern is that this crosses, because it's taxation, into new territory where I think it's the domain of national governments, and there'll be some people who voted to leave the European Union who'll be saying, well, so Britain left the EU, and it's now essentially signing up for not quite government by the G7, but by a supranational body, which is sort of the antithesis of what Brexit was supposed to be about. But then the government, as it always does, points to opinion polling, which is completely obsessed by, as long as the opinion polls don't move, that's fine. That's the measure on which any policy is based, rather than economic first principles. And this stuff, making big, very wealthy businesses and people pay more tax, sounds sort of logically, sounds sensible to voters in the red wall, I imagine. And for that reason, the government is hailing this. And there's also been a long there's a long sort of tail, this story. I mean, it goes right back to Osborne and Cameron and George Osborne was taking credit for it for the process which he began with, I think, with the OECD in 2013. And this process has met its great enthusiast in Biden, or the Biden administration, because they want more tax. They're spending so much money that they need the revenue, and business tax. They're determined to push up business taxes in the US and want to end, as they see it, unfair competition. I don't really see that competition as unfair. If Ireland or a country like that wants to try and attract loads of inward investment, and businesses want to be somewhere that's a lower tax environment, I mean, what's the problem? On the broader question of G7 and whether it is worth all the hassle, you've stayed in the place Cornwall, in Cornwall, where the great shindig is taking place.
Stayed at the Carpus Bay Hotel, and it's a lovely sort of Victorian grand house. They've done it beautifully, modern sort of outside places where you can stay, and it's right overlooking the bay and surrounded by rocks. So goodness, and there's the tiniest road down quite a steep hill, just about 2 bicycles can pass by. So I sort of have this imagination. I don't know how Biden's going to come down in a motorcade or whether he's coming in by helicopter, but it's sort of perfect for a James Bond type sort of swooping in. Lock them all up, hold them hostage until they agree something.
Well, hopefully that's not going to happen.
Delightful. It's a delightful place. It really is. But whether they will actually agree anything, but what I guess is good, isn't it, after a year and a half of people not meeting, and Biden's been, this is his first trip to Europe. So actually that's quite nice to have him on British soil, for him to meet other G7 leaders, and of course for him and Boris to cement the special relationship. Boris doesn't like.
It's in the profile that everyone is talking about this week, which is Tom McTague of The Atlantic has written an in-depth profile of Boris, highly unusual with Boris. Boris, being a journalist, has a suspicion of journalists, quite rightly. And he has given access to having, so Tom has been around traveling with him to Northern Ireland and to various other places.
You went with him to Hartlepool.
Yeah, and Hartlepool, and has got a lot of really good gear out of him, as journalists would say, and a lot of good insights in an attempt to try and get to the real Boris, if the real Boris, if such a thing exists. And Boris says in the interview, or it becomes apparent, that he doesn't like the term special relationship, and I admit I don't either. Actually, I think it's a product of transatlantic media class fixation. I don't think really the Brits are as bothered about needing to hear that word as the Americans think they are. And Johnson's view is that it makes the Brits sound needy. It's a really interesting piece, actually.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful, and there's some lovely little asides, and you sort of realize that the chaotic Boris is actually I think we know that, quite a cleverly designed Boris. But some of his religious points were quite interesting, weren't they?
Yes, Boris claims to be a Christian, or a bad Christian. Which I'm really skeptical of, and I know you're not. You see it from a slightly different perspective. I'm being maybe too cynical, but also Andrew Jimson, his Boris biographer, who's not anti-Boris by any means at all, used to work with Johnson years ago, as did I, in a sort of remote capacity when I was on the comment desk at the Telegraph. But Andrew's view has always been that Boris Johnson is a pre-Christian figure, by which he means essentially Roman in his conception of how the world works, in terms of the role of the emperor, bread and circuses, and that the Romans have a fantastic thing going, a great society running, and then the Christians, in their preachy way, turn up in Rome and ruin it. So that and I've always been persuaded by that Jimson analysis. And in Boris, in the piece, it protests, and it's clearly read some of this stuff, and says, no, it's not true at all. He thinks Christianity is a great sort of value set, and he has great admiration for Christianity and its teachings, and he claims a Christian, albeit a bad Christian. But could that possibly be connected to the fact that he knew when he gave this interview that he was about to get married in Westminster Cathedral?
Yes, he's quite clearly very clever in his timing. But the point about the pagan and the pagan Rome being the great epoch, height of civilization, and moving on to Christianity is perhaps not mutually exclusive, because of course the Roman emperors by then, of course, they adopted Christianity because they saw that it would enhance their power. So actually, it's sort of you could see that that's a continuum. And the other point is, and I don't know that many people perhaps realised it, is that Boris was a baptized Roman Catholic. And what do the Jesuits say? Give me a boy before 7, and I'll have a man for life, something like that. And it's a very deep, pervasive, and quite seductive religion, and clearly carriers. So maybe we've had a Boris in conversion, the second one. Tony Blair, of course, converted. Did he not secretly? His was secret.
I think, but Blair has genuinely
found God.
That is a genuine thing in his youth. That whether it's evangelism or that spirituality is something deep in that questing thing, sort of deep in the Blair personality part of him. I just don't buy that. Don't buy that with Boris.
I think I buy the Roman moving on to Christianity and adopting it as part of their power. That makes
yes, but then there's someone pointed out that Boris had, because there's another theory about that, isn't there? Which I think you can see a bit of in Gibbon when it comes to the decline of the Roman Empire. That actually the roots of disaster for Rome can, if you're so minded, be traced back to that turn towards Christianity, that it fundamentally weakens the Roman conception of self and what the state is, and how how the empire exists, and the role of power. So, and I think there are various examples of Boris writing sympathetically about that, about that theory. But we've ended up talking about Boris and religion, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
But we were going to talk about G's. We were going to talk. It's a really good piece. It's a really, really interesting.
Recommend it to everyone. Yeah. But
we were going to, let's just round off talking about G7. So they're talking about COVID, global economic recovery, climate change, inevitably with COP26 coming up later in the year, and all that jazz. I have to say, I'm having covered some of these sort of summits or various Euro summits and been on the fringes of it and observed it. I'm really cynical about these huge traveling circus affairs that finish with a communique and don't really amount to much. But then I don't want to be too cynical or skeptical about it, because, as you said, after the last 18 months, here is the world getting restarted, and also with in-person meetings. I mean, also, this is an example of the democracies trying to regroup against China, which is hopefully going to be one of the big themes of the next decade or so.
Yeah, and of course, with those great big sort of traveling circus, as you put it, we know that the communique is sort of made up. It is of course to get the hype and to make people feel optimistic, but it's the meetings, it's the side room meetings, isn't it? It's Macron, Biden having coffee, or Merkel, chatting with Boris. That's what's important, and building up those relationships. And we want that. I mean, that's important.
That's true. There seems to be this idea, though, on the fringe,
trapped in Carbis Bay, they can't even get out. So they've got.
There seems to be this idea that on the fringes of it, and this seems to be the EU's typically wrong-headed kind of reading of foreign policy. When the EU tries to do foreign policy, I mean, it's a mighty trade bloc, but it is not yet a foreign policy beast to be reckoned with. The view seems to be that Biden can give Boris a good talking to about the Irish border and about the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the part of the Brexit deal, which now Number 10 says they didn't realize how damaging it was and troublesome it was going to be in terms of British and Northern Irish trade, though skeptics will say, well, plenty of people warned them, but Boris was keen to just sign up and get Brexit done for obvious reasons. But I don't think that is so what you think, Maggie. I don't think that reading of Biden giving Boris a talking to about this is going to shift Boris from a position which is with David Frost, who is his anointed person who's put there to be tough and difficult with the European Union. I don't think Joe Biden saying, look, can you please do what the European Union want, is going to shift Boris at all.
I don't think it was going to shift him. And you know what? I doubt that he would even attempt to. This is not the moment in time, is it really? However much he's committed to it. That would be pushing it a bit too far. I suspect he'd want to smooth it all over. I don't know. Do you think they might say anything about it? It's not really.
You can imagine a form of words being concocted in which the US president reminds everyone that America is a guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement and urges everyone to talk in good faith, and says that there's a hotline, to Washington officials or some rubbish like that. You know how these stories work, and a way to smooth, as you say, smooth things over. But there is, and we'll talk about it more on another episode of Reaction on YouTube. There is a clash coming, or a crunch point coming, which is either the UK government sets about trying to make the Northern Ireland Protocol work and sees it as a question of give and take diplomatically, or the UK government is prepared to essentially collapse the whole thing, which will be interesting, with what that then entails in terms of the EU taking full-scale trade sanctions and tariffs and all sorts of actions which are permitted within the Brexit agreement. And that's coming down the track fairly soon. I must admit, personally, my view is that, or had been, my view had been that Britain signed it and has a duty to try and make the protocol work. But that is not doesn't seem to be the dominant view around number 10 at the moment. It's seen as the EU is acting unreasonably, therefore rendering the Northern Ireland Protocol impossible to implement properly.
But I mean, why can't they? I don't quite understand why they cannot go back. I mean, Frost is right. They underestimated, and I think it's good that he said it. But Brussels is sort of saying, well, you knew what you were signing. Why can't they go back to this joint partnership cooperation committee or whatever it is that's been set up, and then just try and smooth over the edges?
Well, the view communicated from Brussels via various correspondents and analysts in the last few days is that David Frost is the problem. And that they much preferred talking to Michael Gove, who was more, who was of the view that you needed to try and smooth these things over, and Frost is more robust and tougher. I think there's a real danger that in Brussels they're listening to the wrong kind of former British officials who are still in a kind of ancien regime pre-Brexit frame of mind about, and I'm not saying it's impossible. If you look at the breach between Cummings and Johnson, it is possible that Johnson could break with Frost and try to go another approach. I find that highly unlikely. As a concept, I think that it is clear that having got Brexit through, Frost is there to be as robust as possible. I mean, there's a ton of stuff which the Brits could sign up to in terms of veterinary schemes and the like, which would smooth the way, but they see it in fundamental terms of sovereignty. So unless something shifts, I think there is some sort of bust up coming.
The other thing we haven't mentioned, Iain, is what the G7 leaders might be talking about in terms of China and any retaliatory action on what is now almost common acceptance that it perhaps was escaped, let's say. Probably not a bioweapon, but there seems to be so much evidence now pointing. So that would be something to watch for too, I think.
Just that way, exactly. The way in which it's gone from being an outlandish theory always seemed rather plausible to me, that it was created in a lab, with all that we now know about sort of gain of function experiments, all of that sort of stuff. That you're right. This is the first time you'll have leaders together. They're bound to be asked about it. There will have to be some kind of statement on it. The thing that really interests me is there clearly needs to be a proper inquiry into this.
Mm.
And it can't really credibly, after everything that's happened, be the WHO. And if the G7 or related and allied countries decide that there does need to be some sort of international inquiry, what's the body that will do that?
David Frost.
How will it,
they should send David Frost in.
Yeah, I think Frost is pretty robust, but I think the Chinese Communist Party would be pretty robust in return. And then how do you get cooperation from China? It seems highly unlikely that you would. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, that actually, if that becomes the consensus view, and it's gone from being outlandish in the eyes of some to the consensus view in just 2 or 3 weeks, and only a handful of journalists really globally, people like Iain Birrell, and just a handful to pressed ahead with reporting it and uncovering what was really going on and asking the questions at a time when this was being deemed to be fake news and disinformation. That now seems to be the consensus. At some point, you need a statement of intent from Biden, Macron, Johnson, and others about what they see the implications being. But I think we'll wrap things up there, Maggie. The G7 happening on Friday, Saturday, and wrapping up on Sunday with a completely meaningless protocol. No, that's me just being a cynical hack about these things. I'm sure there'll be lots of constructive stuff in it. And as Maggie said, it's good to actually see people gathering in person after the events of the last year or so. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, it's really straightforward. Click subscribe underneath this video. If you haven't visited our site, go to Reaction, www.reaction.life. You get all of Maggie's brilliant writing, all of the writing and reporting from our team, analysis on politics, economics, culture, explaining how the news works, and you get my weekly newsletter as well. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.